In my last video, I spoke about how having a desk job could actually be really bad for your health if you spend all your time sitting, staying at a computer, and don't counterbalance that with the right drills and also lifestyle changes. I said at the end of that video that if people were interested, I'd make a similar video addressing more physically demanding work, manual labor, anything where you're standing all day, and the response to that was massive. So many people said that they wanted to see that I decided to bring it forward to the top of the pile. Especially gardeners. Apparently there are lots of landscape gardeners specifically who watch my channel. So it turns out this is something of an underserved niche, and it's an important topic because obviously a lot of people stand on their feet all day working, and this is going to have an impact on your health and fitness because your body adapts to what you do. It adapts to your environment and your habits. So you need to factor this into your training because you spend hours and hours, 5 days a week at your job, and you spend only a few hours a week at the gym. So obviously the far bigger stimulus is whatever it is that you're doing at work. I also recommend that if you don't do a physical job, you carry on watching. Obviously I'd say that because I want as many people to watch as possible, but there are some lessons here that can apply across the board. What do you think? Does it suit me? I think it does. Some of you who do work at desks at this point might be thinking, what's the problem? You might think that if you're someone who's on your feet all day, lifting heavy things and lugging them around or doing other physically demanding work, then you're going to be pretty fit and in good shape, so you wouldn't need a video like this in the same way that someone sitting at a desk would. But actually that's not true for a whole bunch of reasons. Whilst it is true that outdoors physical work can be really good for you in a bunch of ways, it can build stronger tendons and all sorts of stuff, it's also not a one-stop solution. Builders, the plumbers, they're not all bodybuilders, obviously, because the stimulus isn't quite the same. You don't have the same time under tension, you don't have the same isolation, you don't have the same rest periods. Of course, there's also no progressive overload when it comes to doing a day's work. You're not going to be gradually increasing the weight, and therefore you're not going to be gradually getting stronger in the same way. Every single rep is also different. And also, all these jobs are very different. Obviously, the work of a builder is extremely different than the work of a painter decorator or of a gardener. Some of these jobs involve lifting heavy things a little bit, some of them don't involve lifting heavy things at all. It doesn't mean that you're not still physically active and tired. Then you get home from your hard day at work and you have no energy, and that's why you might find it difficult to go to the gym and to lose weight or build muscle, whatever it is that you want to do. Of course, all that's only if you are someone who struggles with energy. If you come home and you have tons of energy for training, well, that's great. But there's still another aspect to consider, and that's functional performance, pain-free, healthy movement, athleticism. Again, you might not think this is an issue. You might think that all those movements like carrying, digging, and being on your feet all day constitute functional movement. So now what's the pioneer complaining about? The issue is balance. Problems occur when there are big deficits in our movement diet, or when we perform the same few movements over and over, disproportionate to everything else we do. It's the same for powerlifting and bodybuilding. Those are perfectly functional movements, perfectly functional training modalities. The problems only arise if that's all you're doing. If you're standing in the same position all day, that can be an issue. If you're a painter decorator, reaching up to the ceiling and craning your neck for long periods, that can be an issue. If you're always digging on the same side, it can be an issue. Speaking of jobs where you have your hands over your head all the time, that's something I actually have a little bit of experience with personally. I used to work as a jump zone operator. This was like a giant trampoline with a winch and a bungee attached. They're closed down now. I don't think it exists anymore. Maybe because it's dangerous, I don't know. What you would do is you would operate the winch, make it go higher and higher, whilst you'd pull down the tourists and help them to bounce up in the air, and they get higher and higher. But obviously that meant I was looking up all the time like this, also getting kicked in the face regularly. So I got a very stiff neck, stiff shoulders, tight traps, all of that stuff. But that kind of illustrates how what you're doing all during the day can have a big impact on your performance, how you feel the rest of the time. The plus side of that job, the positive, was that when we were waiting for more tourists to come by, we would advertise it by doing flips on there. So you could just bounce around and do flips for free. So that was a pretty cool perk of the job. If you're someone who does lift a lot of bags of cement, what a functional lift, fantastic. But chances are you have a dominant side, chances are you're always lifting on that same side. Same thing goes for screwing in screws, hammering nails. You're going to be using the same side all the time. Digging, you're going to be turning and rotating in the same direction. Over time, this can get so bad that it actually causes a permanent slight twist in the torso. You can lose your rotational mobility in the opposite direction, but you could actually end up with your rib cage slightly twisted permanently. And there's a great example of this from the world of athletics. Baseball players who throw a lot and who hit balls with bats, they're always rotating in the same direction, and this can very often cause tightness and pain and discomfort. So you need something to counterbalance that. The same goes for all these activities. All of them, if you repeat them over and over, are going to start to have detrimental effects unless you're doing something to counterbalance that, which is why a lot of people who work manual jobs, not only are they exhausted and don't have the energy to do their bodybuilding workout or whatever, they also often have pain and discomfort, tightness, mobility issues, because they're repeating the same movement patterns over and over. And it doesn't matter how functional on paper the movement pattern is, if that's all you're doing and you're doing it in massive volume compared to everything else, it's not a healthy balance and you need to do something to address it. And the list of examples goes on and on. So obviously hammering a nail or screwing in screws, this is very good for building really strong grip strength. But at the same time, you're also always going to be flexing the hand. You're going to be squeezing your grip and possibly flexing this way, meaning you can end up with tight, stiff forearms, and this can cause pain and discomfort, loss of mobility again over time. Likewise, if you're always standing on their feet, you can end up with shin splints or tight calves or weak glutes because you're not bending and squatting and running and walking, you're just standing in one position. And this becomes much worse if you find that you're unconsciously placing your weight more onto one side, which is something most people do if they're standing for a long time. If you're at a desk at a checkout, you're likely going to be hunched over as well. If you're a gardener, you're always bending down, squatting down to dig. This can cause tightness and issues with your hips and your ankles, your back, especially if you're always rounding the back to reach over. Same for anything where you're kneeling down on the ground a lot, if you're painting skirting boards, etc. So again, you're ingraining these movement patterns to the detriment of everything else. If you work in a factory or warehouse, you might be required to wear steel-capped boots. And in that case, you're going to likely not have the option to wear the barefoot shoes that I recommend. You're going to have your heels always elevated off the ground, leading to shortened calves, tightness there. Even cardio might be somewhat limited. I mean, a plumber or someone, they're active, but they're not going to be doing a lot of cardio. Likewise, even if you work on a construction site, there might be periods where you're very active. There's also going to be periods of milling around or doing work sitting down. And again, this can be why it's easy to then gain weight. You've been on your feet all day, so you want to eat to bring back some of that energy, but you haven't actually burned as many calories as you might think, so you gain weight. And like I say, you're too tired to do a lot of other things. So how are we going to address this? What are we going to do to work out and build the physique we want when we're already tired and physically exhausted? And how are we going to address some of those imbalances and that tightness to fix, whatever issues we're facing as a result of that? Well, starting out, of course, you want to train in a way that is maximum bang for your buck. You want the MED, minimum effective dose. We're designing these workouts to be as short and palatable as possible so that they're not going to exhaust us. At the same time, we want to minimize that recovery requirement so that we're not recovering from our work and recovering from our training and just leaving ourselves exhausted and at greater risk of injury or just burnout. So we want to focus on exercises that have the very best stimulus to fatigue ratio. That means exercises that provide you with the stimulus for growth, hypertrophy, but that don't leave you completely exhausted. And ironically for that, you're going to want a bodybuilding style approach. That probably means isolation moves, and movements that isolate a specific muscle group like dumbbell curls, and it means closed chain exercises, things like push-ups where you're not involving a lot of balance and rotation and all that stuff, supporting muscles. So in other words, it's kind of the opposite of what I normally recommend, because I would say that most of us use only these very rigid linear exercises. But if you're someone who's twisting and turning, then you've already got that stuff to an extent. We're going to fix it in a moment. You've already got that stuff to an extent. You've already got that kind of more unpredictable movement. So now if you want to build muscle, you need to focus more on stimulus. You need to make sure that you're providing the proper amount of targeted stimulus for the muscles to grow them if you want to. At the same time, we need to keep the workouts short so that you're not going to take too long. I want to use methods to stimulate hypertrophy that aren't going to massively exhaust us. So for example, that means training not to total failure. I mean, there's all this debate about whether you should train to failure or not. I personally do sometimes, quite a lot actually. A high intensity training approach is great for some people. Massive, destructive workouts that you do a couple of times a week. That's not working here because we have to think of our work as another workout. So you have no option but to focus more on volume. And if you're focusing more on volume, that means that you don't want to be going to total failure. So whatever is optimal, don't worry about that. For you, optimal is going to be, stopping short of failure, leaving 1 or 2 reps in the tank on everything, And I'm also going to recommend actually emphasizing the concentric portion of the movement. That means the shortening of the muscle. So one of the tips you often get if you want to build muscle is to emphasize the eccentric. You hear a lot about lengthened partials as well, things like that. This is all great for creating muscle damage, which can stimulate growth. This is one of the 3 things that trigger hypertrophy. There's actually more than 3. A lot of people lately have been commenting on my videos saying like, you don't need metabolic stress or you don't need muscle damage. Well, they all work. Muscle damage causes inflammation, and that inflammation triggers hypertrophy. This is why we know that taking things like ibuprofen, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they reduce hypertrophy because you need that inflammation to maximize hypertrophy. But again, we're not talking optimal for muscle growth. We're talking doable. So we want to emphasize the concentric portion of the movement, reduce that muscle damage, because that's what's going to require more recovery. That's what's going to make it harder for you to then go to work and lift bricks after you've already done a massive workout the night before. Again, it's about the cumulative damage of what you're doing at work and what you're doing at the gym, so you need to be strategic. Concentric only exercises mean things like curling your weights and then not emphasizing the eccentric, but letting it essentially drop down and just dampening, so you don't jar your elbow. So curling up and lowering quickly, like the goblet curls that I showed previously. High rep of just concentric movements like this is great for stimulating the muscle, getting blood flowing there, creating that metabolic stress, which again is a trigger for hypertrophy through multiple mechanisms. And I can make a video on this if you want me to in future. But this is great because it has minimal damage to the muscles. It requires minimal recovery time, meaning it's not going to negatively impact on your work. You can fit it in as well. But you don't have to do that. Just as long as you're not really emphasizing muscle damage, just as long as you're not going to total absolute failure, and you're focusing more on movements that aren't going to massively fatigue the central nervous system. Focus on the long game, focus on choosing a workout that is great for adherence, something you can stick with, and then just have that over time add to the exercise you're already getting from work, and you can build a really strong and impressive physique. It just might take a little bit longer than if you try to go ham every day at the gym, which for most people is going to result in great progress for the first few months, followed by injury, tiredness, and just giving up. And perhaps you can relate. If that's been the case for you, then try this strategy instead. And you want to back all this up, obviously, with lots of rest, lots of food. You're going to increase your protein intake, because the more you're doing in the gym and the more you're doing at work, the more recovery time you need outside of it. It's no good to think of what you're doing at the gym as separate from everything else. You need to consider everything in your routine, not just what you're doing at work, but all the chores you're doing as well. All of it has a recovery cost. So you need to add that up, and then you need to make sure that you're sleeping and eating with that in mind. Finally, what about all those functional changes we talked about? What about the stiffness, the tightness that comes from repeating the same movements over and over again? Well, one simple thing to think about is training the antagonist muscle. That means the opposite muscle, training the opposite movement. So that means, for example, that if you are flexing your wrist all day, if you're always squeezing your hands and having your wrist flexors activate, then you need to do your extensors, on the other side. So that means things like wrist curls with a pronated grip, curling up like this, training the extensors. Obviously, if you're rotating all the time on one side, then you want to make sure that you're also rotating on the other side when you're at the gym training. So if you are someone who always carries things on one side, or if you're digging in one direction, then you want to go and do your cable wood chopper in the opposite direction at the gym, just to balance things out. I recommend doing both, actually, not just the one side, because otherwise you're going to create more imbalances. It's about strengthening both sides. It doesn't have to be perfectly even. It just has to be that you're practicing both movement patterns. One of the very best things to use for this is a club bell or a mace, and to swing it around your head using halos, gamma casts, those kind of exercises, because these teach you that rotating, swinging, throwing motion in both directions, something which, a huge number of people can't do, is just throw on the opposite side of the body. It's going to train those opposite neural patterns, those opposite movement patterns. If you want to hear more about this, I highly recommend Mark Wildman's channel. He's like the goat for this stuff when it comes to, club bells and mace bells and kettlebells. He talks a lot about how the human body is designed for using tools, for doing things like throwing and swinging, and how these tools help to build those movement patterns so that you can move functionally and healthily. If you're always rotating one direction, this is an important way to overcome that. Another good one for if you're on your feet all day is dead hangs, just hanging from a bar. This is great for undoing spinal compression. It's also great for opening up your shoulders, of course, if you're doing anything where you're hunched forwards. If you're someone who stands on your feet all day, then you're going to want to make sure you strengthen your glutes. So doing things like glute bridges. You're going to want to stretch out the calves. So that means deficit calf raises. You're going to want to strengthen the tibialis anterior, so that means raising your foot the other direction so as to reduce shin splints. All these things. Training general mobility and looseness and fluidity is really important. If you're feeling stiff and achy all the time, then just having a really good mobility routine or a movement flow that you can practice to kind of get yourself moving again in all those planes of motions, all those various different ways, that's really important and valuable. Obviously, I can't list every kind of manual work here and then suggest specific fixes and requirements, so you're going to need to do your own research, but just think opposite movements, supporting muscles, that's what you want to make sure you're strengthening. You also want to strengthen the movements themselves, just so that you're not caught out when you lift something heavier or when you get too tired. So if you are doing a lot of lifting, then deadlifts can be useful, but I recommend more focusing on training the correct movement pattern, especially as you start to get tired, rather than piling more on top of your already exhausted body by lifting really heavy weights at the gym. Something like kettlebell swings can be fantastic for training the hip hinge movement. Of course, you also need to think about what you're doing at work and lifestyle changes that you can make to reduce the issue before it even arises. Obviously, the ideal solution to always hammering on one side, always painting with one arm, would be to swap arms more often. But I know that this isn't as easy as it sounds, because obviously you need to do good work. You need to finish it in a reasonable time. You can't be practicing, experimenting with your non-dominant hand for hours. That's not necessarily something you can do, but what you can do is just to vary your movements and your positions as much as possible to be more cognizant of how you're standing and what you're doing. Are you stooping to reach something? Are you always looking up? Take breaks if so. If you're standing at work all day, if you're leaning more just on one side, putting all your weight on one leg, try and address that issue. Try and set reminders for yourself to switch legs. And again, it's also thinking about what you're doing outside of the gym. In particular, for example, your clothing. If you are forced to wear, awkward stiff shoes that make you feel trapped and raise your feet off the floor, then when you're outside of work, then's the time to wear something like a Vivo Barefoot, which is today's sponsor. Vivo Barefoot make barefoot shoes, minimal shoes. That means shoes with a wider toe box for splaying your toes, a thinner sole so you can feel the ground underneath, and no heels so that you're not always in that state of plantar flexion with your foot pointing down and your calf shortened. When your heel is actually allowed to touch the ground, then you're not constantly shortening your calf, and when you do squat, you're getting that nice stretch on your ankles. You can regain some of that mobility. So it's important that if you're spending all day wearing restrictive shoes, you then change into something that's going to give you more freedom of movement when you're outside of the gym. Vivo Barefoot make one of my very favourite barefoot shoes just because of the sheer quality, variety and style. Like a lot of barefoot shoes, they look kind of weird, whereas Vivo Barefoots look great. I get compliments on my shoes, and there's such a variety that you can get boots. So they will be suitable for a lot of types of work. You can likewise get smart shoes, and then shoes for trail running, shoes for the gym, lifting weights, whatever you can think of, and they all look great. They last for ages too, and Bioneer viewers can get 20% off by using the link in the description down below and entering code Bioneer20. Thanks again massively to Vivo Barefoot for sponsoring this video, and now on with the show. You can also find things like tools to help you out. If you are always squatting down on the ground as a gardener, rounding your back, then, get one of those kneeling pads, I don't know what they're called, so that you can kneel somewhat and have less of an issue that way. Something else to consider is that if you can stretch throughout the day whilst you're working, depending on your job, then this is obviously a really good thing. Again, it's really going to depend on your job, but if you have that option and you can set a reminder, maybe even do it on your lunch break, then this can help to reduce some of that stiffness as it builds up throughout the day. I think something to take away from this is that no job is perfect. Whatever you're doing, you're going to have unique challenges that you need to face with your training. But that's one of the things that training should be for, is addressing these issues. It's all very good and well to say, tell your boss this, or take longer breaks, or go for walks, but it's not necessarily possible for all of us all of the time. So instead we have to make do, and we have to find ways to work around it. And that's one of the interesting things about training, is it should be supporting the things you do, whilst at the same time helping you to change in the ways that you want to change and achieve the things you want to achieve. So yeah, I hope some of that's useful. Let me know in the comments down below what issues you face with your specific work and what exercises you found helpful. Hopefully that can be useful for other people reading. If you want a training program that's designed to be highly adaptable, to build not only strength but also cardio, mobility, even cognitive performance, then you can check out my ebook and training program, Super Functional Training 2.0, in the description down below. It's on winter sale right now, so you can get it for just $23 until the end of February. So yeah, check that out. Either way guys, thank you so much for watching this one, and bye for now.